Almost any story trend has an audience somewhere. It may seem like everyone hates that trope or cliche that you're thinking of, but there's at least one person out there like, yay! But if you're like me and you read a lot of fiction, then I'm sure there's at least some trends or tropes or cliches or styles of writing that just make you wanna... Let's talk about mine. What's shaking? My name's Cam, welcome back to another video. So I've mentioned in passing in a lot of my videos, but I've never really talked at length about the fact that I am not a huge fan of multiple POVs, or at the very least, POVs past the 3 or 4 checkpoint. POVs or point of view, if that tickles your beans. I would say anything up to like 3 or 4 POVs is fine. That's actually completely doable for me. But no matter how good the story is, how long or epic it is in the case of fantasy, once you get to like 5 POVs or more, I find myself getting pretty fatigued. Now this is completely subjective, of course. I'm sure lots of you watching are completely different to me on this. I'm sure you're completely opposed to my point of view here, and that's fine. In fact, for that reason, I decided to do a poll over on Twitter and see exactly what you think. The results were super interesting, and so were some of the replies to that tweet, which we'll get to. There was actually a specific reply to that tweet, which I want to talk about more in just a bit. What you'll notice is that out of nearly 100 people, the majority of them are actually cool with anything up to like 6 or 7 POVs, which is quite a lot. So there you go. I guess my opinion in this case is technically unpopular. So I want to elaborate a bit more on why exactly 5 or more POVs for me is just too much. Or in most cases, it's too much. There have been instances where that's been fine, but for the most part, that is where I start noticing that I'm enjoying the story less. So I'm sorry to go back to the Brandon Sanderson well so often, but after reading Stormlight Archive not so long ago, one of my very few complaints for what is essentially one of my favorite fantasy series ever was that a lot of the POVs or side characters felt completely unnecessary. I loved Stormlight Archive, and the epic magnitude of the plot does call for a lot more characters than you would normally find. You know, the same goes for like a story like Game of Thrones, where it's actually really important to get the intimate perspective on all these different characters or storylines or subplots before those storylines clash together. But with that said, and again using Stormlight as an example, I do find it pretty jarring when we're pulled away from the plotline that we're already invested in for a brand new character with their own goals and motivations. 3 or 4 times might be fine, but after that, to me, it feels a lot like filler episodes in a TV show. It feels like you're passing time before we can get back to the exciting bits that we're actually waiting for. I like that Brando Sando and authors like him want to flesh out their side characters and actually give them depth and make them interesting. However, I don't think that always calls for needing to do some of the story from their perspective, from their POV. I don't think they always need their own separate subplot. I just think that maybe when it comes to fantasy, we drastically undervalue the technique of learning about a side character through the already established protagonists. So a lot of the 5+ POV characters that I've read about were there solely to fulfill a purpose that, to be honest, could have just been fulfilled by the main hero, the protagonist. We don't really need to learn about the life story and the fears and the love of a random soldier who ends up saving the king from an assassin while the hero is still on their way, you know, riding here on a horse. If we could instead just remain with the POV of the hero and have them arrive a moment too late to find out that the King's Men already handled it, that the King's Men were much more capable than that hero expected. In fact, that could be a moment to humble the hero. It could be a moment to teach the reader more about them. Teach the reader that the hero thinks too little of regular people, regular soldiers, regular guards, and the hero feels way too much responsibility to always be saving the day themselves. That's just an example, but my point is that rather than another POV, in most cases it could just be an opportunity to do more character development for the actual protagonist. I just feel, and again this is my personal perspective, that when it comes to fantasy, now more than ever authors feel like they're obligated to go bigger and bigger. Longer books, higher stakes, bigger conflicts, more complex magic, more characters, more POVs. And for me, I think it's starting to hit a ceiling where it's just exhausting. Most of us aren't just reading one fantasy series, or we aren't just trying to remember one fantasy series before the next book comes out in a couple of years. I just don't want to keep track of all the different fantasy series I'm reading that each have 10 or more POVs and 20 or more subplots and character arcs. I just think a lot of authors might be asking too much from the reader. And the thing is, not all of them can fall back on it just being a connected universe, like Brandon Sanderson can with his Cosmere. The reason his huge number of POVs work so well in most cases is because he uses them as Easter eggs and references for other unrelated but loosely connected stories within this universe. I think personally, and I know not everyone's going to agree with this, but I would just like to see epic fantasy stories take a bit of a step back and focus on telling the story through a smaller cast of characters. You can still have apocalyptic stakes. I would just ask that you let us read those events through the heroes that we're already emotionally engaged with, rather than introducing a whole new character with a whole new gang of friends. So I mentioned earlier that a particular tweet, a reply to my poll, got me thinking. This one here from Hunter, they say, "There's no such thing as too many POVs if they contribute positively to the telling of the story. Writers and stories shouldn't be put in boxes." Now, I don't disagree with Hunter at all, especially the point about not putting writers or artists in boxes. I completely agree with that. The purpose of my poll, or even this video, isn't to say that there should be a set cutoff number for POVs for fantasy authors. I understand that there is always going to be people who enjoy stories with huge amounts of POVs, and that's fine. However, the reason we can define certain things as good or bad storytelling is because we've learned from reading different stories whether they work or not, and for me personally, too many POVs doesn't work. Example, there's no such thing as too many magic systems in a fantasy story if they contribute positively to the telling of the story. I could say that and have it be true because I've, established that it already has contributed positively to the telling of the story, but we do know that at a certain point, you just can't keep adding magic systems to a story, because eventually, regardless of how interesting those magic systems are, and because of how many there already are, they won't contribute positively to the telling of the story anymore. And the same, I think, goes for POVs. The new POV might be interesting, it may be really important to the A-plot, but it's also the 20th POV we've gotten in this book alone, and the reader is being introduced to another subplot and another group of side characters. At a certain point, like everything in life, there has to be a point of diminishing returns. Maybe they can just do a spin-off novella. Brandon Sanderson has done a ton of those. Anyway, for me, the threshold of POVs seems to be about 4. Give or take. But like we saw on the poll, I actually happen to be in the minority here. I understand that all of this, everything I've said, is just my opinion. So that's fine. But what do you think? Thanks for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. You are my favorite. I make plenty of videos about fantasy books, so if that's your kind of thing, then I would love it if you stuck around. Otherwise, hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Catch ya.